Hello everybody. Today I would like to go in a different direction from my previous video. Now I would like to go back in time and look at an important yet largely forgotten event in human history. Forgotten in the sense that the general population probably doesn't think about it very often, and it's likely that they didn't learn very much about it in school. This event is the Dutch colonization of the Spice Islands in the 1600s. Today, when learning about the age of exploration and colonization, the Dutch colonial activities can get lost in the larger events that occurred. Colonizing Africa, the Americas, the activities of other European powers such as England, France, Spain, and Portugal. And it's not exactly unique in the long history of European imperialism, but it is a very important moment in the history of one of the focuses of this YouTube channel, primitive accumulation and the origins of capitalism. Primitive accumulation, according to Karl Marx's Capital Volume 1, is the process by which large portions of the population were separated from the means of production and forced to become wage laborers. The peasants were driven from the land, communally held areas were privatized and enclosed, and the working class was born. This then kick-started the capitalist system in the process of capitalist accumulation. While Marx primarily focused on this process in England, he does mention the contributions of other nations in laying the foundations of capitalism. In Chapter 31 of Volume 1 of Capital, Marx said, "The different moments of primitive accumulation can be assigned in particular to Spain, Portugal, Holland, France, and England, in more or less chronological order. The different moments of primitive accumulation created by these nations all employ the power of the state, the concentrated and organized force of society, to hasten the process of transformation of the feudal mode of production into the capitalist mode." Then specifically describing Dutch colonial activities, Marx said, "The history of the colonial administration of Holland, and Holland was the head capitalistic nation of the 17th century, is one of the most extraordinary relations of treachery, bribery, massacre, and meanness. Wherever they set foot, devastation and depopulation followed." Now these are rather dramatic descriptions, and they had me curious as to the exact events of Dutch colonialism in the East Indies. So today, I would like to explore these events and the relationship between Dutch colonialism and the origins of capitalism. The region of the world we're going to focus on is the East Indies, which is today the nation of Indonesia. Specifically, I want to focus on the eastern portion of Indonesia that contains a large number of island chains collectively known as the Moluccas. The Moluccas are divided between two Indonesian provinces, North Maluku, which comprises the largest island, Halmahera, as well as the historically important islands of Ternate and Tidore, and has the Sulu Islands, Bacan Islands, and Obi Islands. Maluku, the other province, has the large islands of Seram and Buru, the Kai Islands, Aru Islands, Tanimbar Islands, Barat Daya Islands, the Lis Islands, and Ambon Island. In total, this large region has over 1,000 islands spread out among a dozen different island groups. In general, before the arrival of Europeans, most kingdoms in the region were maritime-based. An island or strip of coastline would serve as a capital, and networks of vassals and trading posts were created on neighboring islands. These maritime empires would be built on the large trade routes in the region, and the Moluccas would become known for their abundance of spices. Hence, they would often be called the Spice Islands. The most valuable spices here were mace, nutmeg, and cloves. Mace and nutmeg both come from the same tree, and were only found on the small Banda Island chain, and thus are very highly prized trade goods. Clove trees were found throughout the region, but were still in such high demand throughout the world that they were also very valuable commodities. The acquisition, control, and exploitation of these spices would be the major driving force of European colonization in the region. The other feature of pre-colonial Indonesia is the spread of Islam. By the time the Europeans arrived, Islam had become the dominant religion on the Malay Peninsula, Sumatra, Java, and Borneo, and was slowly displacing the indigenous religions throughout the Moluccas. Though these indigenous religions remained strong in the interior of islands and in the more remote eastern and southeastern portions of Indonesia. The island of Halmahera is the largest island in the Moluccas. Before the arrival of the Europeans, the island was divided by 4 powerful kingdoms: the Sultanate of Ternate, located on Ternate Island, the Sultanate of Tidore on neighboring Tidore Island, the Sultanate of Bacan on the Bacan Islands, and the Sultanate of Jalolo on mainland Halmahera Island. There was a balance of power between these 4 kingdoms, and so they generally lived in a kind of loose harmony with each other, but there were still historical rivalries over trade and territory. However, the arrival of the Portuguese would upset this balance of power and renew the conflict between Ternate and Tidore. The first Europeans to arrive were the Portuguese, who showed up in the 1520s and began supporting and trading with the Sultanate of Ternate. Tidore then allied with the Spanish, who had also began to explore the region. But the Spanish provided little help, instead preferring to develop their colonies in the Philippine Islands to the north. This meant that Portugal and their ally Ternate would become the dominant powers in the region. Their conquest would eventually result in the subjugation of Jalolo by Ternate, decimating the kingdom's population and plundering its wealth. The Portuguese would also take over Ambon Island, which was located to the south, setting up trading posts and forts there. However, tensions between Ternate and Portugal soon arose. The Portuguese constantly meddled in Ternate's internal affairs, often insulting and executing its rulers and prominent leaders. The Portuguese also promoted Christian missionary activities, which angered the Muslim rulers. Thus, in the 1570s, Ternate went to war against Portugal and, in 1575, managed to expel them and their Christian allies. After this, the Portuguese withdrew to Ambon Island. The first Dutch expedition to the East Indies set sail in 1595. 4 ships and 249 men departed on a 2-year journey to reach the East Indies and bring back spices for trade. In the end, 160 of them would die on the journey, but they would return with enough spices to show that a profit could be made. This set off a wave of expeditions in which, over the next few years, dozens of ships would be sent to the East Indies to acquire more spices. Eventually, Dutch companies realized that competing with each other was undesirable, and that it would be better if they pooled their resources and united to take over the spice trade in the East Indies. Thus, in March 1602, they formed the Dutch East India Company, the VOC. The VOC was granted a charter by the Dutch government, which gave it quasi-sovereign powers to enlist men, wage war, build fortresses, and conclude treaties throughout Asia. Technically, the VOC was subordinate to the Dutch government, but the vast distances between Europe and Asia meant that VOC forces acted autonomously and had very little oversight. The Dutch arrived at an advantageous situation in the Moluccas. Anti-Portuguese sentiment was very strong, and many local rulers were willing to ally with the Dutch in exchange for protection and for expelling the Portuguese. In 1605, the Dutch, with the help of native allies, conquered Ambon, replacing the Portuguese as the region's dominant colonial power. Initially, VOC activities were limited, but this changed in 1619 when Jan Pieterszoon Cohen became Governor General and established a new policy which focused on using any means necessary to create a VOC monopoly over spice cultivation and trade, using their army and navy to destroy everything that got in their way. This would unleash 2 centuries of violent and destructive Dutch conquest of Indonesia. But the native states didn't accept this passively. By the 1630s, the principal opposition to Dutch rule consisted of a loose alliance between Muslims of Hitu, the northern portion of Ambon, and the Ternatean forces on the western peninsula of Seram Island. and these had the support of the Makassarese state of Goa on the neighboring island of Sulawesi. The Hittu built forts in the island's interior, raided and plundered Christian villages, and smuggled cloves in defiance of VOC regulations. From 1633 to 1646, the Hittu would fight a major war of resistance against the Dutch, but ultimately, in 1646, the last Hittu leaders were captured and executed. Their fortresses were conquered and destroyed, and the Hittu resistance was wiped out. Then the Dutch moved against the Ternatians and Makassarese, who defied VOC rule. First, in 1652, the king of Ternate was taken to the VOC headquarters in Batavia on Java and forced to sign a treaty where he agreed that Ternate would destroy all clove production in its territory and the VOC would have exclusive rights to the spice trade. It was now illegal to grow clove trees outside of Ambon, another VOC-held territory, guaranteeing a Dutch monopoly on clove production and trade. From 1652 to 1658, the VOC waged a bloody war against resistance on Ceram. There they depopulated the area through massacres and deportations, and they also destroyed any spice trees they could find. In 1657, the king of Tidore also agreed to eradicate any spice trees and submit to VOC rule. The last major centers of resistance to Dutch power in the Moluccas were crushed. In the 1660s, the Dutch then launched a series of campaigns against the Makassarese kingdoms on Sulawesi that threatened the VOC trade monopoly. By the 1670s, this island had been pacified, and, combined with their conquests on Java, Sumatra, and Borneo, succeeded in eliminating any serious threat to VOC rule in Indonesia, and secured its monopoly over the production and trade of cloves, nutmeg, and mace. The later decades of the 1600s and the beginning of the 1700s would see the VOC conquer the remaining island groups in the southern Moluccas and the western coast of New Guinea. The Dutch utilized a variety of methods to enforce their spice monopoly. As we have already seen, they had no qualms over using military force to destroy any opposition. The VOC was completely willing to invade any kingdom or island that resisted Dutch rule. However, this didn't necessarily mean the Dutch would seize territory. Rather, a large system of native vassals was maintained, and the Dutch would often rule through indirect means. Ternate and Tidore were allowed to maintain large maritime empires. Ternate stretched west to Sulawesi and south to Ceram, while Tidore's was spread out to the east, even to the coast of New Guinea. The Dutch allowed these kingdoms to administer their territory, even backing them militarily if revolts occurred, so long as they remained loyal and carried out the eradication of illegal spice cultivation. This policy of eradication, also called extirpation, of spice trees was used by the VOC to confine spice production to just a few areas that they directly controlled. Any spice cultivation found outside these areas was banned, and any trees that were found were destroyed. Clove production was generally confined to Ambon and the Lees Islands, while nutmeg and mace was confined to the Banda Islands. To enforce this, the Dutch set up a system of native war fleets called hongi. These fleets consisted of rowing vessels and crews that every village was mandated to provide for Dutch use for 1 month every year. These vessels would travel around the neighboring islands and search for illegal spice production and destroy them. The fleets would also be sent to crush rebellious villages or destroy rebel bases. The hongi were an important method for enforcing Dutch rule throughout the Moluccas, as they enabled the Dutch to bolster their military power and terrorize the population into submission. Next, I would like to briefly describe 3 specific areas of the Moluccas and the process of colonization carried out there by the Dutch in order to further flesh out Dutch colonial methods. The first area I would like to discuss is the island of Buru. Buru Island is notable for being ethnically and religiously diverse. The indigenous people who resided in the island's interior were generally Christian, while the coastal areas were settled by Muslims from Sulawesi and had close ties to Makassar. The island was a source of clove cultivation and the site of significant conflict between traders from Makassar and the Dutch East India Company. Throughout the 1630s and 1640s, the Dutch would attack the island, expel rival merchants, and destroy clove trees. In 1658, the Dutch arrived permanently at Kaeli Bay and built a settlement and fort there so they could administer the island and cultivate cloves. In order to control the local population, the Dutch forcibly relocated several villages to the area around their fort in Kaeli, where they could be more easily supervised and forced to work on spice cultivation. The Makassar traders were banned from the island, meaning that the Muslim population was forcibly isolated from their allies. The Dutch also set up regents in Kaeli that administered different parts of the island. The regents were Muslim and often levied oppressive taxes on the indigenous people in the island's interior. In summary, the coastal people of Buru were thus forced into a mixed community with the Dutch as their ever-present overlords, cut off from their former overseas allies and deprived of their local source of revenue from cloves. The next area I would like to talk about is the Ambon Islands. The Ambon Islands consist of Hitu, Litimor, the largest island, Saparua, Haruku, and Nusa Lot, and were known for their clove production. The Ambon Islands are located immediately south of Ceram and east of Buru. As I mentioned earlier, the islands were conquered by the Dutch on February 23, 1605. The Dutch quickly began to establish a monopoly on spices by forcing local authorities to only sell their spices to the VOC at a fixed rate. However, this rate was much lower than what third-party merchants were offering, so many native inhabitants refused to comply with VOC treaties. In response, from 1624 to 1658, the VOC waged a series of wars against any resistance on Ambon and the neighboring islands. Dutch oppression of the native population was so severe that even the Christians briefly rebelled in the 1630s. Dutch forces would attack rebel areas and burn down villages and crops to deprive the rebels of a supply base. Tens of thousands of clove trees and other cash crops were destroyed during Dutch military operations in order to protect their monopoly. The Dutch also sought to limit contact between the native population and other kingdoms in the East Indies by restricting trade and expelling non-VOC merchants. In Ambon, the Honji fleets were widely utilized to help suppress rebels and enforce VOC rule. But the natives stubbornly resisted these attacks and resumed smuggling and illegal trading as soon as the Dutch or Honji fleets left the area. Natives also grew spice trees secretly in the island's interior, in areas where the Dutch couldn't reach. The Dutch had poor knowledge of these islands outside of the coastlines, and often military leaders had little interest in trying to eradicate spice trees in areas they couldn't easily access. All of this meant that the Dutch could never truly establish a complete monopoly on the production and trade of cloves. It's also important to emphasize that the indigenous populations didn't passively submit to Dutch rule. They used a variety of methods to defy Dutch power. Unfortunately, they were unable to form any unified opposition due to a lack of unifying identity or leaders, and were often competing and fighting each other as well as the Dutch. Ambon was also the site of a major diplomatic controversy. In 1623, the Dutch tortured and executed 10 English traders, along with 9 Japanese mercenaries and 1 Portuguese mercenary who were employed by the VOC. They were accused of spying and conspiring to overthrow the VOC administration. The story caused an uproar in England, and the English government demanded the Ambon authorities be punished. Ultimately, the VOC paid out compensation to the survivors, but the Dutch courts found that the colonial authorities were innocent of any misconduct. The affair would hang over the relations between England and the Netherlands for decades, and eventually became part of the casus belli for the First Anglo-Dutch War that broke out in 1652. The last area I'd like to talk about is the Banda Islands. The Banda Islands consist of 6 islands. Lone Thor and Nera Island are the largest. The other 4 islands are Ai, Run, Banda Api, and Hata. This island chain is located in the middle of the ocean about 80 miles south of Ceram. The Banda Islands were important since they were the only place where nutmeg trees grew, and therefore they were the source of the world's nutmeg and mace. The Banda Islands had no king, but instead were ruled by elders and influential men who had no desire to work with Europeans or convert to Christianity. They resisted Portuguese attempts to establish forts on the archipelago. The Dutch arrived in 1599 and attempted to establish trade relations, but little came of this. The English were a little bit more successful when they arrived in 1601 and established trading posts on the islands of Ai and Run. Between 1602 and 1609, the Dutch would visit the islands a few times to force the islanders to agree to grant the VOC exclusive trading rights. However, these agreements were not enforced once the Dutch left, and the natives resumed trading with whoever they wanted. In April 1609, a Dutch fleet under Admiral Peter Veerhof arrived in the Banda Islands with the intent to establish the VOC as the sole spice trading power on the islands. Veerhof began construction of Fort Nassau on Neera Island. But the Bandanese did not trust the Dutch and ambushed and killed Veerhof and 33 of his men. This angered the Dutch, and in August of 1609, they blockaded the islands and forced many elders to agree to only trade with the VOC. But as usual, the Bandanese quickly broke these agreements and smuggled spices to the English, who were willing to pay higher prices than the Dutch. So, on February 27, 1621, the Dutch decided to finally end the Bandanese opposition and take direct control over the islands. A fleet under Governor-General Cohen, which had 52 ships and around 2,000 men, including 100 Japanese mercenaries, invaded Longthur Island and began to massacre the population. Villages were burned, hundreds of people were captured and sold into slavery on Java, and many others fled into the island's mountains, where they died of starvation and exposure. The Dutch rounded up 44 prominent men and village elders and had them executed. The Dutch then went on and seized the remaining islands, except for one, which remained in the hands of the English. Any trade posts outside the ones on Run Island were destroyed by the VOC. Of the 15,000 Bandanese, only around 1,000 survived the invasion. By the 1630s, only around 500 natives would remain in the island chain. The Dutch had now secured the monopoly on nutmeg and mace, but they faced another problem. By massacring and deporting the native population, there was now no one to cultivate spices. To remedy this, the Dutch divided the islands into plantations called perken, the Dutch word for park or garden. In total, there were about 86 perken that was leased to between 34 and 68 perkeners, who were Dutch freemen from Java and Ambon. The perkeners are given possession of the plantations in exchange for growing spice and selling it to the Dutch East India Company. To work the plantations, the VOC imported thousands of slaves from throughout their possessions in Asia who would do all the manual labor. With this, the VOC took total control of the Banda Islands, and the entire colonial system was geared solely for producing spices and guarding the VOC's monopoly on nutmeg. The final island, Run, which was held by the English, would finally be ceded to the Dutch in 1667 as part of the Treaty of Breda. This treaty ended the Second Anglo-Dutch War. In exchange for receiving Run Island, the Dutch gave the English their New Amsterdam colonies in North America centered around Manhattan Island. And this shows just how much things have changed since the 1600s, that the Dutch were willing to give up New York City in exchange for one island in the East Indies. Today, obviously, New York City is one of the most valuable pieces of real estate in the world, and the Banda Islands are completely forgotten. But in the 17th century, the roles were reversed, where the Banda Islands, being wealthy in spices, were extremely valuable, and New York City, having only recently been founded, paled in comparison. With these three areas, we can get a good glimpse at the methods employed by the Dutch to build their colonial empire in Indonesia. These violent and devastating actions would be repeated on hundreds of other islands, and would eventually be used to subjugate the entire region from Sumatra to New Guinea. Wars, massacres, and slavery would be utilized for the singular purpose of building large-scale spice production that would enrich the Dutch East India Company and the Dutch homelands. The VOC would become a powerful force in the 17th and 18th centuries, and their wealth would help fuel European industrialization and capital accumulation. As Marx would say, the colonial system ripened like a hothouse, trade and navigation. The societies monopolia of Luther were powerful levers for concentration of capital. The colony secured a market for the budding manufacturers, and through the monopoly of the market and increased accumulation, the treasures captured outside Europe by undisguised looting, enslavement, and murder floated back to the mother country and were there turned into capital. Holland, which first fully developed the colonial system in 1648, stood already in the acme of its commercial greatness. And the discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the aboriginal population, the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins, signalized the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production. These idyllic proceedings are the chief memento of primitive accumulation. Finally, I would like to briefly discuss the end of the era of Dutch East India Company rule in order to conclude our discussion. Colonial rule would have devastating effects on the powerful kingdoms on Halmahera Island. After numerous wars and rebellions, the sultanates of Jalolo and Bacan were destroyed and turned into mere vassals of Ternate. By the end of the 1700s, the fortunes of Ternate and Tidore had significantly declined due to devastation, depopulation, and losing control over the spice trade. Then, in the 1780s, the last major anti-colonial revolt occurred. This was called the Nuku Rebellion, named after Nuku Muhammad Amiruddin, a prince and later sultan of Tidore. After 2 centuries of Dutch interference in Tidore's internal affairs, Nuku attempted to completely expel the Dutch colonial authorities. His rebellion proved to be very popular and spread across the Spice Islands, to Jalolo, Bacan, Ceram, and even the distant Aru Islands. Nuku's rebels were able to constantly evade capture and frustrate Dutch attempts to control the Moluccas. Nuku was also helped by the British, who were at war with the Dutch at the time. By 1800, Nuku and his British allies managed to take over much of the Moluccas, which he controlled until his death in 1805. Nuku was declared a national hero by Indonesia after its independence, recognizing him as a symbol of the anti-colonial movement. The English would retain control of the Dutch East Indies first from 1796 to 1801 during the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, and then again from 1810 to 1817 during the Napoleonic War. During this time, the English managed to smuggle out nutmeg and clove seeds, and began growing the spices in their colonies in Malaysia, Sri Lanka, and East Africa. This finally broke the Dutch monopoly. The VOC itself had been disbanded by this point. Years of corruption, war, and mismanagement had squandered the company's wealth until it was bankrupted in the 1790s. Finally, in 1798, the Dutch government intervened, nationalized the VOC, and took direct control over the company's colonies throughout Asia, including the East Indies and the Moluccas. Dutch direct rule over the Spice Islands was restored in 1824, where they would spend the next 100 years consolidating the colonies and eliminating any remaining native kingdoms. The final sultans of Ternate and Tidore died, and no replacement was appointed, and the kingdoms were annexed by the Dutch. With the spice monopoly broken, and after many devastating wars and rebellions, the Spice Islands were effectively depopulated and in ruins. What was once a wealthy region was turned into an economic backwater. It's only today, in the 21st century, with the growing tourism industry, that development and wealth are returning to the region. The history of the Moluccas serves as a perfect example of the violence of colonialism and the destruction of both indigenous communities and nature itself that came with the arrival of Europeans. The The wealth extracted from the Spice Islands would enrich the Dutch and the European continent, helping to lay the foundations for capitalist development. Though this video is just skimming the surface of the entire story of the East Indies, I hope that it will provide a useful beginning for anyone who wishes to explore this region in more depth. A region whose histories and societies are far more diverse and complex than what we in the West would be led to believe.